Off air.
Off
There we
air.
go.
There you go.
Live! We're
We're
live!
live.
Hi, everyone. I'm Natasha Del Toro here, and I'm very happy to welcome you to our first Google Hangout on air. We're streaming live from Boston. I'm in Boston, New York City, and Central California to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. Unfortunately, Stable Life filmmaker Tricia Creason Valencia can't make it, but we have two other filmmakers that our audiences are going to be familiar with. We have Rodrigo Reyes, who is the filmmaker of Purgatorio, which is a visually poetic and brutal look at life on the U.S.-Mexico border. Hi, Rodrigo.
Hello.
We also have, there he is, hello. We also have Andres Caballero, who's the filmmaker, one of the filmmakers of Gaucho Del Norte. It's a documentary that follows South American sheep herders who were recruited to work and live very solitary lives in the American West to support their families back home. Welcome, Andres.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you. Well, so let's talk about, so this Hispanic Heritage Month, we have an opportunity to celebrate all of the impact that Latinos have in the U.S. and the latest census I read today. We're 55 million here in the United States, so we're talking about a very large population, large and growing. And what you all are doing, you're making films about the Latino experience. Rodrigo, I want to ask you first. Tell me a little bit about your background and how your background inspired you to make films about the Latino experience.
Well, I was born in Mexico, and as a child, I came to the U.S. and I grew between, California and Mexico City. So I always had this like dual identity, and it was like the overriding thing in my life. So my films gravitated towards that, towards kind of trying to explain like, what is it like to be between two cultures? And you run into all these stories, but sometimes you don't see those stories, in the canon. And you want to explore things, and that's kind of what took me to make the movie about the border. I wanted to figure out, this line that kind of gets drawn around you when you come to America. Everybody wants to know where you're really from, right? So I wanted to kind of explore that relationship and come to terms with the fact that I'm not really that easy to classify. I have like, these relationships with two cultures, and I think that's something that should be celebrated. And like that's something that I've come to learn in the last few years about my identity. It's not really an issue. It's just part of who I am.
That's really interesting because your film very much explores the duality between both cultures along the border. So in a way, it's your own experience. Like you've gone back to the border to explore your own roots, your own identity, and you see those dualities in the film. Really, really interesting. Andres, what about you?
Well, I am also an immigrant. I came to the States when I was a teenager, and I can say that I was undocumented for over 10 years. So the issue has been a big part of my life, my daily life, for a long time. Now I'm no longer undocumented, but through the course of an early journalistic career, I've always also gravitated towards immigration coverage, the issue itself. And when the time came, the opportunity came, and the story presented itself of Gaucho del Norte, I just felt the need to do a story about immigration, but maybe in a different format than the way that I was covering it, than the way that I thought most people were covering it. And it's through this world that not many people know exists in the U.S., the world of sheep herding, and it's so dependent on specifically on immigrants from Chile, Peru, and some other places. So the idea was to tell this story of immigration through the shepherd in an observational way, in a way that just submerges you into this reality, and nothing necessarily political or through talking heads, or it's just simply what you see, and you can pick up on these different elements and what's involved in the immigration issue.
And that's another point with Rodrigo's film as well, that it's not, it's much more artistic than political, but in that portrayal, there are definitely some political messages that come through. Did you know that the Pope mentioned gauchos on his recent visit to the U.S.?
No, I did not.
He did when he addressed, I think it was the U.S. Assembly. He mentioned the gaucho and the work ethic, which is such an important figure. It's such an iconic figure in Argentina, and he mentioned the gaucho as loyal and has like a strong work ethic. And so I thought it was interesting a part that you had, you made your whole film about the gaucho.
Yeah, and that's just one experience, one of many professions, maybe one that's less known here in the States, but it did reflect. I think it was very representative of the work that immigrants come here to do, and definitely in itself, it has a lot of challenges. So it did become this very interesting world to explore.
Mm-hmm. And how did you, one question when I was watching that film, how in the world did you find your subject and follow him from the time he left and came to the U.S.?
Well, I had no idea that sheep herding existed still in the way that it's done so primitively in the U.S. I met a guy who had worked as a shepherd. He was from Chile, same small town as my main character, and him and his wife, they had just gotten married, she's an American, were about to do their interview at immigration for his green card, and I just asked him, what do you do? And he said, I'm a sheep herder. And I said, okay, like biblical times? He said, yeah. And I asked him to tell me more. Eventually, I learned more about the story through him, and he's the one who told me, I have a couple of friends coming, being recruited by some companies in Idaho. If you want to get in touch with them, that's how I got to my main character. And I just called him from New York and said, look, this is what I'm trying to do. I know you're coming. It's a simple thing, fly on the wall sort of thing. Can we follow you during your time in the States? And he agreed. So we actually followed him from Chile, which was another layer that I wanted to add to the film, that being able to see that part of the immigrant experience, the last minutes with his family, the last Christmas in the Patagonian way that they did it. And then obviously that's a huge part of everyone's experience, doesn't matter where you come from, leaving something behind, many times his family, and a beautiful place. And it's nice that we were able to see that with Heraldo. A lot of people who were watching the film asked me, why did he want to leave this place? He has an incredible cabin in front of a lake. Everything is utopic, but many times we're always fixed on the image that the life of the immigrant, it was just straight poverty and so on. And yeah, the economic factor is there, but it's also just the simplicity of wanting to give something more to your family, education and so on. So anyways, that's how we got to Heraldo, and then we followed him to Idaho.
So basically, you stumbled upon them in a line?
Yes, at immigration, in the immigration building in San Francisco, actually.
Incredible. Yeah. Oh, Rodrigo, were you going to say something?
I was just saying, wow. I mean, I thought the movie was beautiful, and the guy does something that is in the American psyche, right? Everybody feels like they could be a cowboy, right? Like we're always talking about this lost West, and here's this guy coming from, across the hemispheres to do this job. I think it's pretty fascinating. It's beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it was interesting. Like you mentioned, it's sort of a new face of the American cowboy, and to a certain level, he did represent that, or what's left. I mean, it's an industry that mainly depends on immigrants, not just because of the low pay, but it's a tough job. Nobody wants to not see their families for months at a time and be alone for that amount of time.
It's brutal. I mean, some of those images, it would seem so cold, and Idaho. You know, they're just out in the wilderness for months at a time, and really something that I don't think many people would want to do, and for such little pay, right? I mean, they weren't getting paid very much at all.
Yeah.
Were you aware of that? Were you thinking this is like redefining the American cowboy as you were making the film?
Well, it was just interesting to me. I think more than that, I was more fascinated with seeing a Latin America, Chilean Gaucho cruising through the West, the Wild West. I think just visually that for me was, and also there were times where he took out his mate. You know, he was a loyal, avid mate drinker, which is a tea, a type of tea that's found in South America, and it's like the equivalent of coffee. And anyways, that's a typical element in the Gaucho lifestyle. So it was interesting to see this guy keep that going in the Northern Hemisphere. And also, you know, times where he would put his music on when he was able to work this really old radio that was already in the trailer he was given in the winter, and he finally gets it on and he puts his music. You know, there's I think that the first image is the music that comes from whatever local radio he was able to tune into. It was I think a corrido. But after that, he put a CD of, you know, his Gaucho music and folk, you know, Latin American folk, and just hearing that music while being there in the middle of this place, and you say, you know, I'm in Idaho, I'm in the desert. It's the juxtaposition was very, very interesting.
Yeah, it was really fantastic. You do such a fantastic job. Both of you do such a fantastic job of capturing the experience and showing an experience that you don't get to see portrayed often in mainstream media. Rodrigo, let me ask you. So, one of the questions that comes up when you're interviewing people. There are ethical responsibilities. When I was out in California, actually in your neck of the woods, I interviewed a few undocumented workers there, and it's really important to hear their voices, but then there's always this ethical concern of what exposing them might do. You know, there are always things to consider. Talk to me a little bit about your ethical responsibility when you approach your interview subjects.
I mean, I feel like ethically, it's a complicated situation, right? Because you're telling this real story that's happening like out in the world, but at the same time, you know, it's about a certain specific person. So my way around that was by not addressing the person's name or the location where that person is, and not making them a identifiable individual that somebody could go and find. At the same time, I feel like it's a catch-22, because if talking about crucial issues makes them ethically difficult for the subjects, then that issue doesn't get talked about either. You know, like there's a lot of discussion going around in Mexico and protests about the student massacre that happened, or the disappearance of these students that happened. And actually today is the anniversary of a massacre that did happen in 1968, right? So a lot of people got punished after the stories were leaked, right? The region where the students disappeared in Guerrero has been suffering a lot of violence, and there's a lot of theories that it's in retaliation to the attention that they got because of the disappearance. But at the same time, you have to discuss it. You know, it's the risk is already there. It's not a clean in or out for these issues. So I think if you're actually trying to do something that you feel is important and that digs deeper than just the surface, you know, with your film or whatever artwork you're doing, then it kind of, that justifies it ethically. I mean, it's sad to see that there's so much resistance around these issues that sometimes it creates, you know, backlash. But that's just part of the nature of making documentaries. I mean, you're engaging with the real world, and the real world sometimes doesn't want to hear what you have to say.
And do you prep your subjects? I mean, how do you explain to them what you're doing and what some of the potential consequences might be of exposing their story?
I think for me, you know, it really depends on the character, because sometimes characters, like in the film, that like the doctor that appears in the film is used to giving media interviews, and he's been in a ton of documentaries actually, let alone like press coverage. And then some of the undocumented migrants that I interview in the film, they're about to cross into the U.S., so they could become a target, or they could become their lives could become problematized by the fact that they appear in this film. At the same time, when I approached them, I asked them, hey, are you interested in people hearing your story without any filter, without without me asking you to take part in anything that is, like that I control the message. For instance, I met them at a church gathering, and the church made them do all these things before they could eat their breakfast, and that's fine for the church's message, right? But nobody was really like there to say, hey, what is your story and what is going on with you, person A, person B, right? Like, what is it that you want to share about your experience and what you've gone through? And I think for subjects that's very valuable. It changes, I feel, if I were to follow these characters over months and months, or maybe even years. I don't know how long Gaucho Del Norte took to shoot, but like if you follow somebody for a protracted period of time, you start to build a relationship, and the film focuses just on their experience, and it becomes something that you have to address more fully, But when you meet somebody for a scene, I think the trade-off is very clear, like your voice, your testimony is part of this mosaic, and it isn't just, all the attention isn't just focused on you and your story. And in exchange, you're providing something valuable to this cinematic experience.
And to a conversation that we need to have. I just wanted to mention for folks that are just joining us now, this is our very first America ReFramed hangout for Hispanic Heritage Month, and we're talking to filmmakers Rodrigo Reyes and Andres Caballero. Rodrigo made the film Purgatorio, and Andres was one of the co-filmmakers of Gaucho del Norte. And you can stream both of those films on americareframed.com or at video.pbs.org. So I just wanted to mention that. Andres, what about you? What are your ethical considerations when you're talking to your subjects? I know you were just in Turkey and you were talking to an interpreter, right? I mean, there must have been. Talk to me a little bit about what was going through your mind and how you approach them and your ethical concerns.
Yeah. Well, I was just in. I was talking to someone in Afghanistan for the next film. It's a story that is still developing, very sensitive as far as security concerns for the person. So. I was, trying my best, obviously, to prioritize their safety. I think just going back to the general picture, and with Heraldo Pacheco from Gaucho del Norte, there wasn't much of a dilemma as far as, he was a recruited, legal worker in the United States, guest worker. So there wasn't much of a concern in that sense. But I think generally I try to just be completely upfront. I try to always pitch them the idea in a way that I can also offer them something. And like Rodrigo was saying, what is it that they're going to get out of this? And you being loyal to that, to that cause as well. And always just remembering that before we are filmmakers or journalists or anything else, we are human beings. And so you have to kind of balance out, the ethical lines that an industry puts on itself, and then also your personal moral values. And I think for storytelling purposes, it's important to always be loyal to the story that you pitched. And also, in my case with Heraldo, it was a long time that we followed him. So it was about 2 years. And the risk with that is that obviously the story evolves. It did in our case, and it was always sort of, sometimes there are good days and bad days. We did several trips to Idaho, but it wasn't all, smooth all the time. So you have to keep working that. You have to keep his trust and keep that idea alive of, this is why we're doing it. and keep him invested in it. So
When
it is
you
a challenge the longer time that you cover.
when you say it wasn't smooth, do you mean there were moments where he didn't want to continue with the film, or what are you talking about?
Yeah, it was really tense moments where, I mean, we always had a really good relationship, but he was a very complicated character in the sense that he had a really hot temper. In fact, in his hometown, and all the sheep herders know that he has a short fuse. So and I was told that and I think that it's things that happen, as if we were 3 weeks in the middle of the forest with him in Idaho, and he has a camera on his face, and just making that transition from being completely alone for a month or two, as happy as he was seeing us there, he's still not quite used to that kind of human exchange, and these guys have really, most of the days are really rough, or let's say it's 3 in the morning, and the winds from the north in the middle of the desert pick up, and all the sheep all get up and start running with the wind, and he has to get up in the middle of Idaho winter and go after them. We show up with a camera in his face. Sometimes there were moments where they weren't very smooth, and you kind of regain that trust, regain that relationship that you had, and that's just an example of it's just that when you cover a story for that period, that length, things are going to come in, and there's going to be a time where you kind of have to resell, the story. So.
Yeah, that was something when I was watching the film. I also, those extremes of him being so alone and you being there with him, I also wondered if when you left, he felt like he must have been so sad that the company that he had was leaving him. Did he ever talk to you about that?
Yeah, well, he always talked about how bored he was, mainly. He was a guy who, he saw himself like as a gaucho as well. So there is this sort of kind of macho front to his character, and he didn't show too much emotion, but there were times where he said, he on the phone, like before it was 7 trips that we made, so he knew when we were coming, and whenever he had signal and we were able to contact him, and he was excited about that. And then when he didn't show too much emotion when we left, but I think one of the last times we were there in the forest with him, the last shoot, I left him a letter, and he was responsive to that, and he kind of opened up and talked about loneliness, and that he appreciated that we were there and so on. But it also, that can we were trying not to. I mean, obviously we're shooting a documentary, exploiting the solitude, loneliness aspect of it. So we're trying not to be present, but obviously it's impossible to completely not engage with him. In fact, there were times where in the middle of the shoots where he wanted to, coexist with us, and didn't know how to keep him, let him know that we're not here. That took a long time getting used to.
Yeah, I imagine. And I wanted to talk about, so we're discussing ethical responsibilities, and you've both given a voice to people, I mean, telling stories about sheep herders or looking at life along the U.S.-Mexico border. Talk to me a little bit about these. We're in an interesting political climate right now with things like, I don't know if you heard about Donald Trump's comment about Mexicans, right, where he said all Mexicans in one of his speeches that all Mexicans are rapists and drug traffickers. He's since retracted his comment, I believe, but when you're in a political climate where there's such rhetoric and people are making comments like this, and you guys are both telling stories to really that address the Latino experience and that offers a much more complete picture of the different kinds of experiences, the range of experiences. Talk to me about why do you feel like it's so important to tell these stories, and how do your films go beyond some of these cliches of how Hispanics are portrayed in the media?
Well, I mean, it's just it's these are American stories. These are like universal stories of our humanity. It's just that they get checkboxed into this very narrow political field. But the storms will pass, and the one night stand of Donald Trump will go away, and we'll be left with this like idea of we are not one. We don't connect with each other. But I think the pain of the border or the experience of Gaucho del Norte, I mean, that's extremely American. It's human. What is American? I don't think people even who feel so scared about immigrants even understand what America really is about. I mean, we're so complex, and we're so diverse, and we're so rich, and our art has to reflect that. And whether people are willing to listen now or listen later, that doesn't take away, from the truth of that. I mean, it's a larger truth, I think, than what you see on the campaign trail. So often, like the campaign trail is about fog and mirrors and all this other stuff, but it doesn't really ground itself in like the life of one person, like in Andres's film, or it doesn't even take a look at the place itself, the border itself, like we did in Purgatorio. And it's just, Purgatorio is a frustrating film. It's a difficult film. It's a complex film because you have all these characters echoing each other all the time and giving you different points of view. But that's reality, So it doesn't. I don't really get intimidated or upset when I hear Donald Trump saying those things, because I see it as a challenge for our community, whether we're from Chile or Peru or anywhere, just to kind of start getting our voices together and kind of organize ourselves politically. I think it's actually a positive thing, because he makes this urgency for us to respond. Mm-hmm. Whereas without him, I think the Latino population as a whole has kind of coasted a little bit on this issue of how do we come together in spite of all our differences. If you're like this old school Chicano, or like you just arrived today from Latin America, like there's something that bonds that experience. And I think we have to take this opportunity, because we're not always going to have such a clear like ogre or boogeyman to reference. You know what I'm saying?
So Donald Trump is galvanizing Hispanics in the U.S. then to organize and speak out, and perhaps to make art like what you guys are doing and make documentaries.
Yeah, definitely. And in a sense, we're lucky that a candidate is willing to say things so clearly and just crassly and offensively, because it makes it very clear for us that we need to really like step up our own game. But I feel like politically, even though we're 55 million people, there's a lot of lack of unison, and that's the real crisis, I think, for this for the Latino communities. How do we unite? How do we work together? How do we affect the public dialogue? Because Donald Trump is not going to get elected, but that voice might go back into the underground, into people's like quiet conversations at home, instead of being so public and so open and kind of gross about it. And so I think we really need to reflect about how do we come together, as a community, and how do we build these bridges around people like this guy.
Right, definitely. Andres?
I agree with Rodrigo that it's a good opportunity for us to kind of step up our game, and as filmmakers too, in the way that we portray Latinos in the U.S. But again, Donald Trump is a politician now, and the things that he says, like many politicians, it's always made to speak to a certain group of people, sympathizers who have a certain sort of stereotype political ideology, and his words were in a way demonizing Latinos. But I think that that's where we sort of come in. For example, in Gaucho del Norte, we're showing the experience of immigrant sheep herders who support an industry. Without them, this industry will collapse. And in a way, that's what we need to show. There's also a misconception that Latinos, or immigrants, I should say, take more than what they give. And I think that you know, there is a large group of people in the United States who still believe that, and this is how we can show that people like Heraldo Pacheco, who have to come and leave their families for 3 years, they're the ones keeping an industry alive. They're the ones who are keeping these family ranchers, these ranchers who, you know, who have been herding sheep for generations in business. So I think in a way we need to do a better job at portraying Latinos and in a way in how what they bring to the table, and show what they bring to the table rather than what they take or benefit from.
Both very eloquent responses. But the problem is there's large segments of the population who, for whatever reason, are feeling, you know, they're like you said, sympathizing with, and Donald Trump may be speaking for large segments of the population. The question is, how can they see your work? You know, it seems like we have a very polarized media. You know, talk a little bit about the value of public media in this conversation, because you're not seeing these films so much on commercial or mainstream news outlets.
Who do you want to answer that first?
Rodrigo.
Okay, so I mean, you know, that's kind of an issue that all media has right now. You know, especially in the film world, it's like you think of an idea to make a film, you work hard, you bring your people together, and then, you know, you have no place to really show it, and that's where broadcast comes in. You know, public broadcast is a place to put your film out there and really kind of put it into a conversation and into a population that wants to engage with the issues. Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess there's two ways to look at it. You could say, well, it's an uphill battle, you know, because there's so much stuff out there, but at the same time, you know, it's part of a conversation, and the work has to have a value in and of itself to be out there. You know, it has to respond to this reality. It has to be of this world. And how do you get somebody that's watching only one media outlet and it's super conservative and doesn't branch out to other types of consumption? It's a difficult thing to do, but you have to keep trying, and I think broadcast gives you the greatest possibility, especially a public broadcast, because you're definitely open to everybody, and you're creating, you know, a space for a conversation, and it will happen. You might not, you know, hit 300 million Americans, but you're going to hit a lot of people, and a lot of people will have an opportunity to reflect and to think about the work you created.
Mm-hmm. Andres?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's obviously still a lot of work to be done. I mean, Latinos aren't fully being represented as far as, you know, the Latinos who are in the newsrooms, the Latinos who are in television, and in the same way, the content isn't necessarily representative of the percentage of Latinos in the U.S. And that are, you know, serving to that audience, but not only that, just showing the Latino experience properly to the mainstream media. I think what I like about, you know, public media is that, you know, of course they open the doors to projects that are different and perhaps maybe bring a little more substance to the stories, to the conversation. So I think it's some of the few outlets that we have that are doing that today and doing that service are in public media. So it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah, you raise an interesting point. I mean, considering, again, that we have, according to the last U.S. Census, 55 million Latinos in this country, and that number is growing, and by 2060, I think it's supposed to be something like close to 120 million Latinos are going to be living in this country, so 31% of the population, right? So we're talking about a massive group. This is a huge cultural shift and change, and we need to understand, you know, what is the experience of these people? What are the experiences, and what are the issues? Because I mean, this is a huge segment of the population, and it is changing the face of this country. So I was reading an article the other day from an emerging Latina actress who was saying that still a lot of the parts that she gets are, you know, the maid or just, you know, still sort of these cliches that you get in the media of Latinos. How do you all move beyond those cliches? What are the cliches, first of all, and how are you all trying to move beyond it? Is it simply by telling the personal story? Rodrigo.
So you know, like what you're saying is something I wrestled with for a long time, and I used to think that the work needs to be overtly political and overtly address this issue. You know, like you have like the gang member, you have the maid, or like, you know, is typically uneducated with bad English, but also bad Spanish, and it's just a very superficial look at our culture. And then I started looking at the career of a writer I really love, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, right? And you look at his life, and it's super political, but then you look at his career, and it's all his best books are about love, most of them, right? They're all about people in love. And so what he's saying is, I embrace life, I embrace my universe, I embrace my community, and I create like this, the best art that I can from this place. And I think that's really how, you know, as a filmmaker, how you should think about it, because it isn't the issue, it's about the community, it's about celebrating like your own cultural context and celebrating it as a human value, you know, taking it to that scale, making that character or that story like something that anybody can relate to, something that is just, that has value in and of itself, you know, because that's going to shift the paradigm, you know, that's going to shift it a lot more than attacking the politics from the point of view of a filmmaker, you know, just creating amazing, interesting stories out of this context, you know, where you might be at the intersection of all these different identities, and nobody else can tell a story from that point of view. I think that's very valuable, and I think people really respond to that.
So addressing these universal themes.
Yeah, addressing the humanity and the, you know, like if you really work and see your work as a piece of art, that grants it enough value and dignity to exist. And if you're true to yourself, you're going to talk about your community, and you're going to talk about it in a way that feels authentic and celebrates it just because it's art. You know, I think of books like I said, like 100 Years of Solitude. It's like, you know, it's an amazing book. It doesn't, the characters are not black or white. It lives in its own universe, and it's something that touched people across the whole globe. And I think sometimes in the U.S. we forget about that. Like, it's just like the person the person living across the freeway or on the other side of the tracks, you know, their story is just as valuable and just as powerful and complex as anybody else's, you know. And I think that I'm very excited whenever I see work that is complex and that really cuts across that and just exists within its own universe. You know, like in Andres' story, you see like this guy, you know, taking on a role that blurs these borders, and also, you know, his personal journey as a guy who realizes what are the values that he really cares about. Is it the money, or is it being at home with his family? And that's something anybody can relate to. And when you see it, you know, with a Latino context, it really crosses a bridge, you know, because an audience that watches it, even another Latino, realizes, you know, like that's a part of our experience that I had never seen before, you know, and that's what makes it powerful to me.
And the sacrifices that people are willing to make, I think, is also something that is very humbling as a viewer. I just want to, just real quick, I want to chime in and remind people, in case they're just joining us now, that we're about halfway through our hangout, and that if people want to, they can send you guys questions. They can tweet comments on Facebook or Twitter at America ReFramed, hashtag HHM, which stands for Hispanic Heritage Month. So before we wrap up here, just to let people know that they can send you guys questions, and I'll try to get to those questions so that you all can answer them. So Andres, what were you like? You know, continuing that conversation. What are your thoughts about moving beyond some of those cliches?
Yeah, I think obviously in the mainstream media, mostly we see these characters that you pointed out. You know, any stereotypical character supposedly representative of Latinos, um, the maid, the gardener, and so on. Nothing, wrong with those professions, of course, but I think one thing that's changing, as you were giving the statistics of the population and how it's moving, the Latino population in the U.S., how it's growing. We also need to understand that Latinos are no longer, or not necessarily see Latinos as a minority. Instead, embracing the idea that Latinos are now part of the mainstream, and the characters that we see should also be picked, by these producers or directors or whoever is making these decisions in the media. Just being conscious of that, and not necessarily separating, the different races in within their shows or programs and so on. So I think, I think there's still, in general, we're still quite behind in that sense.
I want to shift now the conversation a little bit to the craft. Both of you have done an amazing job of, I mean, the cinematography in your films is really stunning. Is this part of a Latino documentary aesthetic? Talk a little bit about your craftsmanship in your filmmaking and some of the way that you visualize your stories. Andres.
Okay, sure. So I think that I'm not sure exactly if I can pinpoint the general aesthetic of Latino cinema or film, but the films, for example, that I've sort of gravitated towards tend to be, from Latin American filmmakers like Pablo Larraín, Lisandro Alonso. Very, the pace is definitely slower than what we would see in most U.S. films, generalizing, and just a more observational approach, maybe a little more raw, and I think that's what I've sort of started to embrace in an early filmmaking career, and the idea again of making a documentary, telling an immigration story in an observational way, where neither I or my co-director were in it, in a way that you have this environment, this raw environment, this experience that you're watching the immigrant go through, that really hopefully catches the spirit, the immigrant spirit, and in a way helps you process immigration at a more personal level, rather than through the political lens, or through a film that is with a more activist tone. So I think that the style of Gaucho Del Norte is very much inspired not only by these influences that I mentioned, but also the type of story that we wanted to tell, and not necessarily chew it for the viewer, but just have them feel and decide what's wrong with this picture, and also appreciate the romance and the darkness that is all within this world of sheep herding.
And the same goes, I guess, for you, Rodrigo, in terms of, I mean, would you consider your film observational filmmaking?
I would consider it like poetic filmmaking. I think it takes so long to make a documentary. You want to make it beautiful because beauty connects to something very raw, very human, all across the board. I mean, this film just got requested for a festival in India, right? And like, what is it that connects the audience to that? I think part of it is the power of the image, and you have to think about that experience that your viewer is having, because it isn't news. I think for a long time we confused documentary and news, and they're two very different things, and they kind of complement each other, but they're not the same. And so for me, I wanted audiences to feel this place, through this lens of like portrait, a portrait of the landscape, a portrait of these people, and I felt that was very valuable because it really hit the viewers really strongly. It really makes it a lot more of a visceral viewing experience because it's so beautiful, but at the same time it's so broken. And that contrast is very frustrating for a lot of viewers, but once they get through it, they realize that the beauty and the violence of the situation kind of go hand in hand. They're not opposite to each other. And so that's kind of one of the things I feel is so interesting about making films, because you create an experience for somebody, and then they have to go through this whole experience that you crafted and that you built piece by piece. So for me, the most exciting films that I see come out are usually documentaries because they play with the form, they bring in fiction elements, they do all sorts of things that are just so built around the beauty of the experience. Whereas you go into your multiplex and so many of those pieces are like very they're full of tropes and they're very predictable. Whereas a documentary could be told all from found footage or all by the observational technique or by creating these landscapes and these beautiful portraits of people. So
it's
I always feel very excited. Yeah.
It's not formulaic then. And with your filmmaking, I mean, is there a Latino documentary aesthetic?
I would think about where does that end? Where's the border of that? Is it just in the U.S.? I think if we're thinking about the U.S., I think it does as well, like Andres says, to look, to our colleagues and our cousins in Latin America, because they're doing very fascinating things with documentary. Pushing the art form, and so that's where I look too. I look to folks in Mexico, or I look to folks across the continent, and just to be inspired by how they approach story and how they approach, like challenging the viewer with very complex material in innovative ways.
And you've shown this to audiences both in Mexico and in the U.S., and now you said it's being requested in India, yeah? Tell me what kind of response have you gotten from different audiences?
I mean, it's very interesting. The U.S. and the Mexico audiences kind of mirror each other. They both feel like they discover this place through the film, because the conversation, especially when I get to talk to audiences, you realize that it's an issue that is uncomfortable, and many people don't want to look at this border. They don't really want to look at the details of what life is like in this place. And so the film becomes an experience and a communal journey for both communities. And I think that's very valuable, because if we're talking about, doing some sort of policy for the border, whether you're in Mexico or the U.S., you need to experience this place and you need to feel this place. So it always turns to that. And for instance, in Mexico, people talk about never knowing where their father or their mother went through, like never knowing what this limit line was like. And that's very valuable.
And Andres?
The response that we've received from the audience where we have presented the film. I mean, it's only been in the U.S. So far. We did have one screening towards the beginning of the project at the Guadalajara International Film Festival in L.A. So the audience was mainly, many who came from Mexico. In general, it was sort of this. They seemed curious, and many, many had no idea, just like I didn't. About this world of sheep herding. So in that sense, it introduced something. They were happy to be introduced into a new world they didn't really know existed. And also, as far as people with different ideologies or views on immigration, I think we found that both people who were more sympathetic to immigrants, they responded very positively in the same way as people who weren't, who tend not to be. And they just, because they liked the way that they felt that there was a character, Rubber Ball, the rancher, and we showed it was just mainly showing another reality, which is the family, an American family who's been doing this for generations and is struggling, and it's, you know, you see that you know that they pay these guys $750 a month, which is nothing. But at the same time, you know that they also have their struggle, and they were great people, and if they could, they would probably be delighted to pay these guys more. But they're also caught up in the middle of this sort of antiquated immigration system, also, you know, which also involves labor laws. So I think people in general appreciated that we were able to cover both experiences.
I just wanted to say real quick before we're like kind of winding down, getting towards the end of our conversation. If you're just tuning in, don't despair. You can watch this on. You can stream the conversation on America ReFrame's YouTube channel, which is, you can subscribe here. I think I'm pointing somewhere at it. So if you're just joining our conversation and you want to catch the whole thing, subscribe to our YouTube channel and you can watch the whole thing there. So I want to go now, as we're starting to wind down, let's talk a little bit about what advice would you both give to emerging Latino filmmakers now that you've been at this game for a little while? What would you tell them? Andres or Rodrigo? Let's start with Rodrigo.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like I started feeling passionate and trying to change the narrative about the community, and then I discovered that, you know, the community has a lot of complications. People aren't always just victims of the system, they're just people. So I would just embrace the stories that come across in your life and work from there, you know, work from that experience of that story in your family that happened to your friend or is happening in your community, and just embrace it as a work of art and look at it as something that is just as valuable as any other story. It's just not being heard. And kind of put the politics to one side for the creative part of the process, because the politics are going to be there. If you do something honest, if you do something sincere, it's going to be very political because it's going to be very real. And it's going to be something that people haven't heard before. And that's very, you know, that's almost like an act of cultural resistance. But then you lead with the story, and that would be my advice. Lead
with the story. And Andres?
Yeah, I would say, you know, always look for ways to challenge people's tolerance, to challenge the audience, and to, you know, I think we should all, and I consider myself, you know, also a young starting filmmaker, and I think that always taking on that duty to tackle the issues. You know, obviously for me, immigration has been big, but doing it in different ways, always trying to find a different way to do it. It's a lot of responsibility because, you know, you're sort of coming in, even with a film, and you're addressing a specific issue, and people are numb to it. You know, the media has done it in a certain way for a certain amount of time, and people are numb. So you're coming in, and you just have to, you know, focus on constantly being creative to keep people's attention, or kind of capture that attention momentarily. So I think always keep challenging yourself and finding these new ways to tell the story. And as I said before, also something that I always go by is remember that you are a human before you're anything else, and to always be in touch with that humanity. And I think, like Rodrigo said, that putting politics aside and putting this sort of conventional style of storytelling through, you know, always having that voice of political talking heads or even activists sometimes can sometimes deviate from the creative aspect and from the actual expression of that the story needs to have. So I also back that.
And what are you working on now? What's your next film?
So now, again, me and my co-director Sofian Khan are working now on a story. It doesn't involve the Latino experience, but it's also on immigration. It follows the the impact that the war in Iraq and Afghanistan has had on interpreters who worked with U.S. troops. And once the war ended, what happens to these guys? Many have lost their lives, and we try to follow different characters, Iraqis and Afghans, and try to show what happened with them, what's being done for them, not being done for them, and how they're rebuilding their lives after the war. So it's focused on the interpreter experience.
And they're in very precarious situations, right? I mean, they can't. No one can know if they're still there. If their identity is revealed, they could be put in a lot of danger.
Exactly, and many of these interpreters who were with U.S. troops have been hard-marked men by the Taliban, by ISIS, or other militias. They're considered traitors, to their countries for working with the U.S. And these guys were, part of the group of people that, a large group of people in Iraq who were trying to rebuild their country, who were trying to help their country move forward. And instead, now 10 years later, they're not only their countries you can argue whether it's better off or not, but they're definitely not better off. They've given it all, and now their families are also at risk. So they just have to leave, and that's the bottom line.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it does. I heard a story on the radio the other day about I guess the U.S. was supposed to offer asylum to some of these interpreters and hasn't followed through on the promise yet.
Yeah, it's improved in the past year or two, but yes, at the beginning. It took a while for the U.S. to come up with some sort of system. They came up with something called the SIV program, Special Immigrant Visa Program, for Iraqis and Afghans, specifically interpreters who work with U.S. troops. These are the guys who made sure that the soldiers came back to the States, to their families safely. And for a while, yeah, the U.S. wasn't recognizing that by providing them an escape. So the SIV visa program came in, and then there were, for some reason, let's say they offered X amount of visas for Afghan interpreters. A whole year went with just a fraction of those visas available being handed out. They improved that. However, still, it takes an average of 4 years or so, 3.5 to 4 years for someone who applies for an SIV to make it to the States, where the system was designed to get someone to safety in about 9 months. So there are problems that need to be fixed, bureaucracy, the way the system works. But it's an issue because a lot of these guys and their families are waiting to get out. They're in hiding, and they're just, anything could happen at any time. So.
Wow, that sounds fascinating. Can't wait to see that when it comes out. Rodrigo, tell me, what are you up to now? What's your next film?
I'm also working on a project about interpreting, so I'm gonna go have coffee with Andres when I'm in New York.
Yeah, once I get off this chat, you guys can continue talking. So.
Yeah, no, we should chat because I work as an interpreter actually, and I work in the California criminal courts, but it's totally different. Nobody wants to shoot the interpreter; they want to shoot the guy he's interpreting for, right?
Right.
Like I'm always like the ghost, and I get to go home, and nobody cares about me. But what would happen if I was suddenly made the center of attention? That'd be awful. Yeah, and so I started following a guy that I worked with in a case. I was doing his murder trial, and then he was sentenced, and I wanted to find out more about him, how he got to be in that situation. He was such a young guy from the Pacific coast of Mexico, and I just needed to know why I felt so connected to him. And I pursued a friendship. I started writing to him, and through these letters we kind of started exploring this situation where there's a lot of borders in our relationship. There's a class border, there's an immigrant border, there's an education border, and so it's a very fascinating kind of film, and it's my first film that I've ever done where I follow a character for more than 3 years, which is where we're at now. So
cool. Well, we have one question from our that I wanted to throw out there from one of our viewers, a woman named Sabine, who wants to know, do you find yourself gravitating towards Latino stories when planning or daydreaming about your next films? Andres? Or, yeah, why don't we start with Andres?
Sure. So do we find ourselves gravitating towards Latino stories when thinking about the next film?
Yeah.
I think usually I do, but more in my journalistic work. I think it's more, for me. It's more about immigration. How can we tell another story? How can we show another angle of the immigrant experience? And I don't think I feel necessarily tied to, to the Latino community in that sense, because, I'm one of many immigrants. I am Latino, but obviously there are so many different. That's what makes the United States. It's a melting pot, although that's a cliche, but it's the truth. And so I've never been fixed in, okay, now I have to tell another Latino story in this format.
So it's more the immigration, the shared experience around immigration. What about you, Rodrigo? Do you find yourself gravitating towards stories about Latinos?
Hello. Yeah, I always have like a double, like two things going on. Like on one hand, I feel like there's a sense of duty that I have to tell these stories, and then on the other hand, I do keep running into these stories. So I always just kind of go with my gut and just follow a story that really moves me and that really makes me want to like get immersed into it, and that's what I go with, whether it turns out to be Latino or not. I mean, that's just the context of my experience, and I don't feel like, I feel like the danger with that is like you sometimes feel like you want to justify your existence through your work, but I think the work has to just speak for itself. So I've kind of started just going with whatever it is that I'm really attracted to, and if it happens to be labeled Latino, that's fine. But I really just wanted to have these qualities that are much larger than just one identity group, because I think that in and of itself enriches that identity and makes it more interesting and complex.
Mm-hmm. Well, Sabine, I want to thank Sabine for asking the question. It was a great question. And we are going to wrap up now. This was our first Google Hangout, and I wanted to say thank you to Rodrigo and thank you to Andres. Really great conversation. And thanks for bearing with us with any sort of weird technical things. Like I said, we're just getting started with this, but I really enjoyed the content of the conversation, and I hope our viewers did too. And hopefully this will inspire them, for those who haven't seen these films that we were talking about, to go to our website, americareframed.com, to see these films online, these wonderful films. Purgatorio, which is going to be, here I've got the schedule for our lineup for Hispanic Heritage Month. We've got Purgatorio that's going to be airing again on September 15th. Wait, is that September 15th? Oh, it aired September 15th. Okay, so that's Gaucho Del Norte, September 22nd was going to be airing. And of course, Purgatorio is directed by Rodrigo Reyes. Gaucho Del Norte, directed by Sofia Khan and Andres Caballero. We were just talking to Andres. Stable Life, directed by Sarah McPherson, is going to be airing October 6th. And Deputized, which is directed by Susan Hagedorn, and that's going to be October 13th. So anyone that is interested can watch these films, these great films, on our website, americareframed.com. And so for more information, follow us on social media and check out America Reframed's website at worldchannel.org. Thank you again for joining us on Friday night. We hope to do this again soon. And we can't wait to see your work. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Natasha. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.